Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from EHDman, who asked, "Hey Thor, do you think these shows would flow better and taper expectations if they stopped being named after one character and so limited? More and more I wish they would just make a show that drops a 13 to 20 episode season every 2 to 3 years like Game of Thrones, that hops perspectives and feels more cohesive. Also could taper the criticism of naming a show after one character and focusing on another. Reva in Kenobi, Bo in Mando Season 3, Mando in Book of Boba Fett." And I do kind of think at some point Star Wars forgot their Star Wars and not Marvel or the MCU. That naming shows or movies after characters isn't going to work as well for you as it does for them, because Marvel really is all about its characters, which doesn't mean Star Wars isn't per se. But when Marvel announces a new show or a new movie, people just automatically assume it's a new superhero, and it usually is. It's one taken from the pages of comic books, obviously. And they're expecting and anticipating and wanting that. They're expecting a more focused on a singular character story that may or may not have some bigger stakes attached to it. They may even do a little research or read an article that pops up online or a video they see on YouTube about this new character, and they'll get excited for them and their story to come. But I really don't think most people have that same sort of attitude towards Star Wars. I think when people hear Star Wars, they think big, sweeping space epic with lots of characters and huge stakes and tons of action. And so when they hear a name like Ahsoka, for example, keeping in mind a lot of people out there have never heard of her, or maybe only know the name. They've heard the name, they don't even know what it is. But when they hear a name like that for a Star Wars show, it's kinda confusing. It doesn't resonate with or mean anything to them. It doesn't compute with what Star Wars should be in their mind. It doesn't have that same kind of feeling something called The Empire Strikes Back did, which again is a big, grandiose sounding name, even if in reality it's one of the smaller stories we see in the films. But of course it's not exactly easy, or should I say cheap, to deliver high production value, huge scale Star Wars to the small screen for Disney Plus in any kind of consistent way. And though I do like and maybe would prefer the idea of perhaps a 12 or hell even a 15 episode season of hour-long episodes of this huge scale and much bigger budget show that would come out once a year or maybe even every other year or a year and a half or so, which would probably help give Star Wars back that special feeling since it would be a bit more rare again. Anyway, even though in many ways that may sound better than getting multiple shows a year of, shall we say, lesser quality or just kind of cheaper, it really wouldn't make a whole lot of business sense for Disney to do it that way, to dump all this money into one show for 12 weeks every other year or so, considering people would just unsub after it was over and then wouldn't sub again until the next season came around in a year or two. And so at least with multiple shows spread out over the year, there's a chance that people who are only there for Star Wars, only subscribing to Disney Plus for Star Wars, might just say screw it and keep their subscriptions in those couple of months where there's downtime, or maybe they'll watch the Marvel show that's going on. There is a lot of crossover between those two. Or they'll just forget to cancel it till the next show comes around. Either way, I am a bit surprised that every single live-action Star Wars show on Disney Plus thus far has essentially been named after a character. I mean, the one movie they named after a character, that of course being Solo, was a failure at the box office. It lost money when all was said and done, the only Star Wars movie to ever get close to even doing that. And Han is, of course, one of the biggest, most beloved characters in the entire franchise. So, if his name couldn't pull people in, what made them think other names would? And yet, with the release of Disney Plus came a show called The Mandalorian, which, sure, you could argue is not exactly a specific character name, but it's also not exactly the most grandiose name either, especially considering there are a lot of people out there who have no idea what a Mandalorian is, or they didn't before the show came out. Even telling them something along the lines of, that's the kind of armor Boba Fett was wearing, wouldn't exactly mean anything to them. Nevertheless, despite the name, The Mandalorian was a huge success, and despite the fact that, no, it wasn't exactly what people generally tend to expect out of Star Wars. It was not this big epic story that spanned the galaxy and saw the fate of the whole thing on the line. It was instead something much smaller, and yet it still worked. People still watched in large numbers and absolutely loved it. And I really think Disney and Lucasfilm had short-term memory loss with Solo, and they saw the success of The Mandalorian and thought it meant that, yeah, we can sort of go Marvel style here on Disney Plus. That people will not only accept smaller scale, truly character-focused Star Wars stories, but that they could really, really enjoy them as well. That we don't necessarily have to go huge budget, galactic scale stories. We can focus on small things and be okay with that. Problem is, I don't think it was really Star Wars itself that drew people in, or should I say what kept them around with The Mandalorian. Because yeah, a lot of people, even sort of non-fans, they were of course going to be curious about the first ever live action Star Wars show and check it out. You knew a lot of people were going to try it out just to see what it was like, or because that Star Wars name still held some weight with them, even if again they weren't huge fans. Once upon a time everyone kind of just watched or gravitated to Star Wars. But I think what ultimately really hooked the more general audience was simply Mando and Grogu. I think people just loved that dynamic, even more so than they loved anything Star Wars about it. And don't get me wrong, if that works, it works. I've argued many times before that Star Wars canon should take many different forms, as long as it, in general, sticks with its roots and gives us those kind of big, fun, action-packed good versus evil type stories that it's famous for. As long as it keeps doing that regularly, I think everything else is going to be okay. And so I'm by no means trying to deconstruct or belittle the success of The Mandalorian and say it's only because of this or that and it's somehow less impressive because of that. I personally loved the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian. I think it's some pretty damn good Star Wars, and I'm glad it did so well. All I'm saying is that relationship, Grogu and Mando, plus, yeah, the cute factor of Grogu, that it captured the hearts and minds of a lot of people, and it didn't really matter that it was Star Wars to them at all. It wasn't turning them into Star Wars fans as much as they were just fans of them, of those 2 characters and their story together. And yes, I realize that's a somewhat silly statement to make because a lot of people who watched and fell in love with Star Wars originally did so because of the characters, as people may watch any show or movie and come to love it simply because of the characters. In fact, that tends to be the key to success for virtually any story, how much people like and or care about the characters, how vested they are in their story. But my point is, if you took the Mando-Grogu dynamic out of Star Wars, out of that galaxy, and repackaged it into another show or setting, I still think it works just as well. I think there were a lot of people who just liked them and their story and weren't really thinking, Mandalorians are cool and I want more of this, or I want to watch even more Star Wars because of this show. I'm not so sure it really acted as a gateway to the rest of the galaxy, if you will. And I could certainly be wrong about that, and I'm not saying that nobody watched The Mandalorian and became a true Star Wars fan afterwards, but I personally, or in my personal day-to-day life, I know a few different people, quite a few actually, who were indeed only watching it for those 2 characters, and actually mainly Grogu, and had little to no interest in the rest of Star Wars at all. And when Grogu went off with Luke at the end of Season 2, they didn't think they'd be back for the Season 3 because that was literally the only reason they were watching it. Which, as I've said before, is one of the reasons why I fully believe Grogu and Mando were brought back together so quickly, why they were even reunited before the start of the 3rd season in a whole other show. Because I think Disney and Lucasfilm feared a lot of people would not watch that 3rd season unless they knew they'd get their favorite duo back once again. But anyway, what's maybe a little ironic about some of these shows that we're now getting on Disney Plus, like the Ahsoka series right now, is that they've been more or less kind of trying to aim for that more traditional Star Wars feeling. They've been bringing in some of the bigger elements again, yet they named the show after a character again. Which, yeah, don't get me wrong, I love Ahsoka, and I know plenty of fans out there do, but I've literally been asked by people who aren't so much fans, what's an Ahsoka? Because they still don't seem to associate Star Wars, or the shows, with character names. Same went with Andor, and even more so in that case. I had a lot of people ask me, what's that even supposed to be? Because they just don't get it. They don't remember him from Rogue One. And once they did, once I told them, it confused them as to why he'd be getting a show because, well, for one, they have that Marvel mindset where when a show has a character name, that it's really going to be about that character primarily. Plus, the only thing a lot of them did remember after I told them who he was that he died at the end of Rogue One, and they didn't know why he, of all characters, was getting a backstory show, essentially. Though, of course, Andor wasn't only about him, not even close. Instead, he was simply a branching out point for many other characters and stories. And though I can understand why you'd call it Andor, the name does make sense when you watch the show, it still should have been named something more Star Wars-like. Even something cheesy like Dark Reign of the Empire would have been a better name, and got more people to sit up and take notice and easily understood what it would be about before even watching it. Not to mention, and as the comment pointed out, oftentimes with these character-named shows, they don't even end up being about the character you'd expect, nor anything like what you expect in general. The Book of Boba Fett is a perfect example of this. Not only did Fennec Shand get a good deal of the spotlight, but 2 whole episodes out of 7 didn't even really have Boba Fett in them. They were more Mandalorian episodes. Plus, I think most casual fans who know the name Boba Fett know him as being a badass bounty hunter and simply wanted to see that, not him becoming a respectable crime boss. But anyway, to wrap this up, I do think that, especially with the benefit of hindsight here, that Star Wars has been a little too influenced by the success of Marvel and to its detriment. These are 2 different things and they really should be treated 2 separate ways. Though I mean, yes, obviously Star Wars has some incredible characters, some of the biggest in pop culture ever, and they are very well known and loved and could certainly carry a show. The Kenobi series was an example of a name working to bring in a lot of viewers, but then trying to go bigger scale and making a mess out of it. As I've said before, if there was ever a time for Star Wars to go smaller scale, character focused, it was the Kenobi series. But let's be real here. For better or worse, like it or not, what attracts most people to Star Wars, what attracts that general audience, is not character names. It is the thought of bigger-than-life stories with plenty of cool action. That's what they watch Star Wars for. And as I was saying before, that is not cheap or easy to pull off unless you have a pretty massive budget, which isn't exactly going to happen on Disney+. Not consistently, and not if they ever want to become profitable or just stick around at this point. And to me, all this really says is it's another way that Disney just didn't understand Star Wars. Another way that they're unfortunately failing it. And I don't know how they turn it around, because I don't know that Star Wars can ever thrive on something like Disney Plus unless the money is behind it. Because again, people expect more out of Star Wars than just a simple character story, which doesn't mean that it can never work or should never be done. But that's just what people want. They want big Star Wars stories. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about all this. Do shows named after characters hurt Star Wars, or is it really not that big of a deal? Do people watch regardless of the name? Or you can ask a question for a future lightning response video. Just start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and ask away. Whatever you choose to do, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.